thank you so much, Brandi and Jonathan, for being with us. Brandi K. Adams is assistant professor in the Department of English at Arizona State University. She focuses on book history, early modern English drama, and pre-modern critical race studies, and is editing Merry Wives of Windsor with Jonathan Hope, who also teaches Shakespeare at Arizona State University after nearly 20 years of doing so in Glasgow, Scotland. And he, with Brandi, is editing Shakespeare's version of Merry Wives for the new Cambridge Shakespeare. So thank you guys so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
So one thing we've obviously talked about today is this question of adaptation. Playwrights and composers have been adapting Merry Wives since at least the early 18th century, if not perhaps before. And as we've spoken about, at least 10 operas are based on the play, Verdi's being the most famous. So what makes Merry Wives in particular particularly fruitful for this kind of adaptation? Or why is it a particularly useful or popular source text for playwrights and composers?
Okay, I'll go first, Brandi, and then Brandi can be more intelligent afterwards. So I think that the main thing is it's not finished.
Okay.
And it's, the text as we have it is quite clearly a working theatrical text. There are plot lines that get introduced but don't get developed. It looks like there are things that might have been deleted. There are things that are added in the folio text that weren't in the quarto. So I mean, it's impossible not to adapt this play if you're trying to put it on, even if you're trying to do a kind of straight production. So there's that, and I think it's the Shakespeare play which people are most comfortable about messing on with.
Okay.
Changing the language for all of those kinds of reasons.
I think that because Falstaff's literally larger than life and appears in more than one play, although it can be argued that maybe it's not the same exact person, but there's a reason why I think early critics sort of glommed onto him as a character. He's brash, he's loud, he sort of says what he wants, he does what he wants. He sort of functions both inside and outside of a set hierarchy. So he is a knight, but he doesn't act like one, and sort of allows people to think about what are the ways in which you can push the limits of class and push the limits of company, because he gets to hang out with all kinds of people, but also can sort of run back to the monarch or a prince when he needs to. And then I think in Merry Wives in particular, he's definitely an outsider that the community kind of just isn't sure what to do with. And I think that might be another reason why, because he's so outlandish that people are just constantly like, well, he's just sort of interjected into a conversation that we're all having, or he's made himself known. And then we can't help but look at him. And then we look at each other and wonder what's going on. And I think that's a reason why people sort of focus on him.
Right. I love this idea that he's such an outlandish, outsized character that you have this sort of classic setup of like the individual versus society, which is a sort of overly simplistic way of putting it, but those two things reflect each other. So because he's so outlandish and he doesn't really fit as either a nobleman or, a fool, that sort of reflects the social context in which he's embedded. But also his behavior requires all those people around him to reflect on who he is and what he's doing. So they sort of have they're sort of mirroring each other in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he's also outlandish in Shakespeare's Merry Wives, because there's a kind of weird double time scheme going on in that play. That it's set ostensibly in Shakespeare's own time, and I just heard the previous speaker emphasizing that and saying how unusual that is in Shakespeare's plays, and that's true. But it's also set in the medieval period of Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. And there are references to the king, which is pretty clearly implied to be Henry IV. So there's this kind of double time going on. And Falstaff is clearly someone from the medieval period in this play. And the wives are clearly people from Shakespeare's own day. And that's why he's kind of weirdly out of time in this play, and in a way that he's not in the Henry IV plays. And I think that's what you're picking up on in the way that he does seem to stand out. And it's not in this play, it's not in a very comfortable way, I think. That's why he has this, I mean, he can do all kinds of stuff in the Henry IV plays with language and with getting away with things that Shakespeare does not let him do in Merry Wives. And I think it's because he's out of time, and and he struggles with it. So and when Brandi said it's arguable that he's not the same character between these sets of plays, I think that's really true, that he's very, very different. He can't do the stuff he does in the Henry IV plays.
That's so interesting. So what makes him stand out is not just his behavior, but the fact that he seems to be, I don't want to say copied and pasted, but taken from a previous era and sort of put in a context where his behavior, his language doesn't make sense or isn't legible in the same way that it was previously.
Yeah, and also he's copy and pasted, but copy and pasting implies it's the same person, but
right.
I think, it doesn't take very much reading of Merry Wives to get the idea that Falstaff is a kind of sexual harasser, and actually a failed one as well. He's not even very good at it. Whereas, there's nothing of that in the Henry IV plays. He's a kind of anti-hero there. I mean, there's no sense in which he's an anti-hero in Merry Wives, although to their shame, several middle-aged previous editors of the play have tried to argue that he is, which their introductions make very uncomfortable reading now. I was teaching the play about 2 weeks ago, and one of my very good students made the point when we were talking about the kind of Henry IV and Merry Wives relationship, and they were really interested in the notion of a character who appears in multiple plays, and she said, oh, it's like the Marvel Comics universe, and you've got characters reappearing in different plays. And I think it's true, and it's also a bit like the Batman films, where you have nominally the same character, but actually between the different films being played in very, very different ways.
Right. So the Christian Bale Batman is not the same as the George Clooney Batman, even though it's in theory the same character, right?
Yeah. And I think that's what happens in Merry Wives. And there's a whole bunch of theatrical tradition about how it got to be written, which is probably a fiction, but it's kind of a nice fiction. And it does, the notion that Queen Elizabeth basically commissioned Shakespeare to write Merry Wives because she wanted to see more of Falstaff. It kind of tells you, even if it's not true, it tells you about something about how people respond to the character and how they want to see it repeated.
Great. So I want to pick up on something you said, which, since we're talking about bringing students to see Falstaff who might be younger because Falstaff is so comic and nothing too serious or violent happens, it's sort of friendlier, at least in terms of opera for younger audiences. But how do you deal with this question with students, which I know your students are college age, but how do you deal with this question of looking at someone who is supposed to be a kind of womanizer or seducer or harasser, and sort of take it seriously as a problem for interpretation, as a problem for teaching, and as a problem that is obviously on students' minds? And this is something that, in opera, we have Don Giovanni, we have many other of these kinds of figures that we're looking at now from a different perspective than we have historically. As you mentioned, former editors of Shakespeare maybe would have thought about Falstaff in a different way than we do now. And so how do you deal with that in the classroom? How do you deal with that with young people?
Well, I think that students who are taking this, who take Shakespeare now, are already more attuned to it. They already see subtle moments where they notice that the women of Merry Wives are reacting very differently to Falstaff's shenanigans. Mm-hmm. They immediately figure out that he's written them the same letter, and they both sort of laugh and sort of marvel at who he is and how he is. And I think students immediately pick up on that, and then they think about phone scamming, or they think about email scams, or they think about things where someone is just trying to get an answer from someone. So they're just sort of throwing out information to see sort of who comes back with some kind of an answer. And they also, I think, are quick to sort of say, oh, well, there are some people who are just like that, and Falstaff is one of those people. And isn't it interesting that this is something that happens in a play that was, written in the late 16th, early 17th century, and how these sorts of problems for women don't go away. And so they get to sort of think about how quickly they notice these things. And then this is an opportunity to talk about editing and to talk about comments that previous editors that Jonathan's already sort of mentioned might say, well, this is like men will be men or boys will be boys.
Right.
And the students are like, no, that's not what we were taught. And then that gives them an opportunity to talk about how different people read these plays in different ways. And then if you are going to be creating an edition, you acknowledge that people viewed at one point Falstaff's actions as perfectly fine. That happens at my office, makes sense. And now I think that having a different set of editors who are like, it made me really uncomfortable to read this early introduction to Merry Wives. I'm not going to repeat what these other people said, so that I can make sure that the play feels more inclusive, and recognizes this major flaw, but doesn't shut down the conversation. I think it's just a great opportunity to sort of notice how astute your students already are.
And my experience is that my students, I mean, they don't have a problem identifying Falstaff in this play as problematic.
Right.
And they actually are more, in some respects, more interested in the depiction of the wives, and as independent, financially in charge women who also run the plot and run the play, and they kind of recognize that. And we're talking about how Merry Wives is unique in Shakespeare's works. It's also unique in it. It's the only play where the two titular characters are women, and where the women. There are lots of plays in Shakespeare where women have agency and control the plot, but they always have to dress up as men to do it. And this is the only Shakespeare play where the women can be women, dressed as women, and control what's going on. And my students respond to that and really find that fascinating. And Falstaff is not really a problem to them, I don't think. As Brandi's saying, they're saying, oh yeah, we recognize people, there are people like this, and he gets his, they deal with him. I think one of the really interesting things about Merry Wives is the Merry Wives, which sounds like an obvious thing to say, but the kind of literary, editorial, critical tradition focuses on Falstaff, surprise, because most of it's written by middle-aged guys who probably wish they could get away with the stuff that he gets away with.
Right.
But Shakespeare is a pretty good writer, and I suspect became more and more aware of the kind of problematic nature of Falstaff as a character. And if I kind of sometimes think that if it's true that Queen Elizabeth made him write the play, that he kind of got his revenge by making Falstaff an idiot.
Yeah, I love, since we talked about why this play is so adaptable and, that it's unfinished, or that Falstaff is this outsized, extravagant figure who's very easy to sort of work with. But the question of these women driving the plot and really being the main sort of like movers narratively and dramatically is probably also something that lends itself to adaptation, especially in sort of contemporary theater and film. Jocelyn Bio's recent Merry Wives is a great example of that. So that's also something that students can latch on to when it comes to, adapting Shakespeare, that it's driven by these two women who are scheming to, sort of get back at the guy who thinks he's the schemer. So there's this irony built into the whole thing, which I love.
It's also worth saying, the opera is an adaptation. There have been all of these adaptations that you're talking about, but Merry Wives is itself an adaptation. I mean, it's kind of stitched together.
I was just about to ask you this, because in your bio, I noticed, being trained in close reading, you said you're editing Shakespeare's version of Merry Wives. And so it got me thinking, okay, what are the other Merry Wives that are, how is it Shakespeare's version? What does that mean?
Good question. Yeah, so Merry Wives is takes characters that Shakespeare had created who in some cases are kind of pseudo-historical, in that we think there's an actual person that Shakespeare based Falstaff on historically. But it's also an adaptation in the sense that Shakespeare uses plot elements from various, mainly Italian stories, which is one of the things that appealed to Verdi for why he wanted to work on it. But Shakespeare's, all of Shakespeare's plays are adapted in the sense that he doesn't make them up. He takes the plots, he takes elements from all kinds of places. And source hunting is sometimes represented as being quite dry, but actually it's astounding once you look at the original, the stories that we think Shakespeare used to as the kind of building matter of Merry Wives. The Shakespeare never just takes things straight. He always twists things around. Mm-hmm. So the kind of the way that Falstaff is treated and the kind of tricks that the Merry Wives play on him are a version of a story where let's see if I can get this right, that the kind of Falstaff figure is actually the lover of an Italian woman, and she disguises him in order to get him away from her jealous husband. So the elements are the same, but there's a kind of reversal in the relationship between the woman and the person getting dressed up as the old woman of Brentford. And that's very typical of Shakespeare, that he kind of puts these switches around, and the jealousy is transferred onto one of the wives of the Merry Wives, and it's not you can see how his imagination works in the way that he adapts things. It's never just, I'm going to do a kind of slightly different version of that. It's bits get taken from various places and reversed and put in new positions. He does make things new.
Right. That's great, because it makes me think about, we've talked about Verdi sort of playing with the Shakespearean source text, and it seems like that's actually a very Shakespearean thing to do, to have these source texts and then combine them, recombine them, sort of reshape them in whatever way suits the project.
I think something in Verdi's genius comes through in the fact that he recognizes that Falstaff in Merry Wives is a very different character to Falstaff in the Henry IV plays, and a quite substantial amount of the material he uses comes from the Henry IV plays. Mm-hmm. I think because he wanted the character to be more kind of relatable, and he knew, which a lot of actually Shakespearean critics haven't managed to spot, that the Falstaff in the Merry Wives is a pretty unpleasant, or at least actually not that interesting character. Mm-hmm. So he draws the material from the Henry IV plays, and that really means that he taps into what made Falstaff a theatrical sensation.
Yeah, Brandi, did you want to hop in?
I also think that there's something to say about the sort of modern landscape of Merry Wives, where Shakespeare's also adapting new slang, new terms, new relationships between people. And you've got this old character kind of walking into scenes and walking out of scenes. There's, how characters talk to each other, how cosmopolitan they are, how many different languages they speak. And Falstaff's still an English speaker who thinks about England in a particular way. Meanwhile, French people, Welsh people, all kinds of people have come into London. London has expanded. And Jonathan has talked brilliantly about this, sort of the geographic space of London and its cosmopolitan nature, and how Falstaff kind of butts against that. He's a medieval character who understands the world in a particular way, and that world has passed him by. And he's still fighting to be sort of current. But the conversations that are going on around him are like pop cultural, and the references are funny, and they've referenced geography that didn't exist when Falstaff's like first incarnation. So I think it's really interesting to see how Shakespeare tried to map these two things together, where even though Falstaff's there, to me, Merry Wives feels like a very fun city comedy, where if I were a young gentleman who was working at Inns of Court as a lawyer, I would go check out Merry Wives and some other plays that were city, sort of centered in the city. And then I would laugh because I was smart enough to recognize the characters from the history plays that maybe I saw when I was younger, or maybe someone told me about them, or maybe I read about them. And you can sort of see the absurdity of having this old character come in where in a fast talking environment where people have different accents that maybe he can't catch, but everybody in the audience knows because they're just more cosmopolitan. So I think Shakespeare has a lot of fun with Merry Wives that maybe when I first encountered it as a reader, I was just very confused because I was like, well, should I be paying attention to Falstaff? He doesn't seem very nice. And I really like the Merry Wives. I would actually really rather if the play were just focused on them all together. Why is the critical tradition obsessed with Falstaff? And I think that now there's a definite shift. And particularly with the production that was at the Public, if any of you got to see it, the Merry Wives stole the show. Falstaff was an amazing character, was wonderfully played, but I couldn't take my eyes off of the Merry Wives. And I think that shift is something that's truly significant. And so now when you look at Verdi's opera, to me, I keep thinking about the specter of the wives. Maybe some modern operettist will write Merry Wives focusing on Merry Wives.
That sounds like a great idea for somebody to do, not myself.
Not me.
So I want to pick up on something you just said, something that you said previously, and then ask you more about this question of comedy. One, which is because we're going to do a book club around Merry Wives of Windsor, reading it over a couple of weeks. I just love that both of you have emphasized that when you go and pick out an edition of Shakespeare from Barnes & Noble or Amazon or what have you, what you're reading is an interpretation that has been made by whoever has edited that text. So this is maybe just a note to myself to think really hard about what edition we choose for our partners who are doing the book club, because we want to make sure we're sending them the right or the optimal or one of the best choices for whatever that edition is, but that there is no, single text that is the original or the perfect edition, but whatever you pick up in a bookstore is going to be the product of a series of choices that are made by those editors, publishers, scholars, etc. So that's just a great point to keep in mind, that there is no single source that we can go to and say, this is the one we're going to read.
Absolutely.
Not until ours comes out.
Yeah.
That's right. Once buy our book. But
Yeah.
but I also think that even if you were to read, like, I guess what would be called the first edition, or the
Right.
core, which is like the handheld printed version of the play, which is in fact very different from the folio edition, which came out in 1623, even if you were going to read one of those as the text that you read in your book club, you would still have to think about intervention in terms of the printers who were, sort of working as compositors, who may have misread handwriting or decided, wait, that doesn't sound right, I'll make a slight change.
Right.
And you have the people who may have had a slightly different, or there are differences between these two plays. Someone who's sort of super radical like I am would say, actually, they're two different plays. I don't even read them in the same way. There's always an intervention. And who makes that intervention, I think, is really important and can change how you look at the play. If you're an editor who's like, Falstaff's a great guy, like, I'm not going to question anything. And then you have other editors who are saying, well, I have some questions. You have editors who end up getting really fascinated. Like, Jonathan told me all kinds of things about fencing that I had no idea. I didn't understand the jokes because I'm like, that might be about fencing, but I'm not interested in that. And Jonathan's like, this whole joke rests on the fact that you need to understand how swords worked. I was like, okay. I turn around and I'm like, Jonathan, they keep using the word like bully. I'm like, this is like a pop cultural bro. And he's like, oh, you're right. And so we have these conversations where you need like editors looking at these things in different ways, people who are willing to have Jonathan go down a rabbit hole of fencing manuals, me go down a different rabbit hole, being like, when did this become like a way of announcing your bro? Why does it mean this? And then you get sort of all kinds of really exciting results. And I think that when you choose an edition, you want to make it so that people feel like they can still think about those choices, and also think that whatever they think is just as interesting and valid. And the questions that they have aren't, oh, it's because I don't understand it. It's because there's something that you're seeing that you want to know more about.
Right. So I want to pick up on this point about comedy and getting it, or not being in on the joke if you don't understand fencing or something else. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how comedy works in Merry Wives, how comic language works. I know it's a big question, especially because that gets translated differently in opera. And we've, in some of our educator materials, we've talked about, slapstick versus wordplay versus, different ways that comedy can be conveyed. So I'm just wondering if you could talk for a few minutes about how comic language works and how students might have a way in to it.
That's Jonathan. He's the language.
So I mean, one of the reasons I really like teaching Merry Wives is the language, but one of the reasons is that there are so many pop cultural references, so many time specific references in the play, that and there are a lot of them that editors today do not understand. We've just lost the reference. So I usually teach with the Folger edition, and one of the things I like about it is quite a lot of the notes just say, we have no idea what this means. And I try to say to my students, it is okay not to understand everything, because nobody understands everything.
It's a known unknown, right?
Yeah. And and it's also, that's the nature of comedy. It tends to be in the moment. Things that we laugh at hilariously right today, in about 3 or 4 years' time, will A, not be funny, and probably B, not understood. And so actually comedies need more notes than tragedies, probably. Because there's just layers and layers of very, very deep things that everyone at the time would have known about straight away, but now need to be explained. And of course, you have to explain the joke, and it's certainly not going to be funny. But yeah, I mean, just to give some examples of that. So at one point, when Shallow early on is trying to show off in front of Anne Page, and he mentions Sackerson. He says, I've seen Sackerson. Mm-hmm. And Sackerson was a celebrity bear in Elizabethan London. It was unfortunately famous because he was involved in bear baiting, which is a horrible, very violent sport. But the first audiences of Merry Wives, that would have been fantastic. Everyone knew the bear Sackerson. It was the most famous bear in Elizabethan London. But of course, now you need a whole long note to explain that. And so there's that kind of density of reference that if we historically we can find that out, we can explain it. But there are a whole lot of other stuff that's kind of unexplained. I mean, the whole first scene of Merry Wives is very arcane jokes about heraldry. And it's hard for me to believe that even at the time that was funny. I think it's deliberately unfunny. But lots of that, we can see that there's a joke there, but it's impossible to work out what the joke was. And there's one great article that came out in about 2014 trying to explain the history of the salt fish. Someone makes a comment about a salt fish, and it's clear that it's supposed to be a kind of killing final line in a joke. Nobody, no editor, no scholar of Shakespeare has been able to work out over 200 years of trying what this reference is. And there's a great article where a guy just said, I'm going to write about this crux. People have been working on it for 200 years. Nobody has moved us forward at all.
It's good to know there's still some work for the young people of the world to take on for individual independent projects. But I love this because it gives students a way in. It suggests that maybe the extent to which students or even any of us in our contemporary period have trouble understanding the jokes is actually a way into the work, because we can think about, okay, what is your inside joke? What is the reference that you can make that your friends will think is hilarious? The meme that is going viral on TikTok that everybody hears that sound and like cries from laughter, which I can name several, that will not be legible or coherent either to anybody who isn't in your social group or who isn't your age, or just maybe 10 years from now. And so it's actually that kind of like difficulty of understanding the jokes that is also possibly a way to get students involved in actually making it funny or thinking about how they understand things to be funny.
Yeah, and I think it would be a great classroom exercise to say to students, here's the opening scene of Merry Wives. Nobody understands it. It's really
make
unfunny.
It funny.
Adapt it and make it funny. Make it funny in present day terms, and I bet they would.
So we just have a few minutes left. I just want to ask a sort of obvious question just to close, which is, obviously we're thinking about the musical operatic adaptation of Shakespeare, but Shakespeare's plays themselves, of course, involved music and singing. Some of these songs are in the text, some are sort of implied, or were brought in by performers but aren't indicated in the text themselves, if I'm not wrong. Can you tell us a little something about the way that musical performance was brought into Shakespearean productions when they were being produced, or at least the musical culture of these plays?
Okay, I can say something not about Merry Wives specifically, but Julius Caesar. There's a 1599 diary entry from Thomas Platter, who had seen Julius Caesar, and he talks about the end of the play where he's like, yes, people died, Brutus died, that was sad, but there was this performance of dancers, and that was good. And I think that that I think about these sort of interludes that are happening. And music is something that maybe when I started working on plays, I didn't think very much about. But then when I read Macbeth and they talk about the hautboys, which are oboes, I have a friend who's an oboist. So I texted her and was like, okay, so Macbeth, oboes, what do you think? And she was like, yes, we're musicians. We talk about oboes all the time in Macbeth.
Like we already know.
Yeah, we know. And I'm like,
yeah.
no, I'm not doing it to be like a did you know, but like you tell me, how do you do this? And she's like, okay, let me explain. So oboes do this, and oboes can make these noises, and I can make these noises. So here's how I would do it. And then because she knows about the history of the oboe, because she's a PhD student in music history, specifically on the oboe, she's like, okay, so when oboes were invented, and I'm like taking notes and thinking about how music gets incorporated. And I think some of it has to do with like disciplinary conversations where I know my own is like, I'm not going to bother this person. They've got their own stuff to do. I shouldn't like ask for 2 hours of their time to talk, to explain to me about how music works or how they think music might have worked. And then now we have more scholars who are doing like really exciting interdisciplinary work on music, or they think about ballads, or they've read all of these ballads, and then they start to notice, oh, this ballad appears in this, in this play. Or I think of in terms of Merry Wives, it could be a really good ad-lib moment for Falstaff to sing a song that's not recognizable by anybody else. And then you have everyone else singing while they're all together a song that Falstaff's like, I don't get that. And I think that would be kind of a fun moment too. But I think music is where we get to speculate, which I love speculation. I'm probably a bad literary historian for it, but I really love to speculate and think about what are all these things that could have happened. Or is it just that, Shakespeare's friend who's an oboist happened to be in town and decided to, or one of your actors, which some of the younger young man actors, if they were taken from choirs, then they could sing. And then why not give people a wonderful performance from a singer who used to be a choir member for a church, because these are sounds that people know, and these are voices that people know. So I think it's maybe more incorporated, but we just don't have the notes to be like, here's the song. It's just like a song. And sometimes you get the words and sometimes you don't. But in modern adaptations, it becomes really exciting to see what directors do, and then how they highlight their cast members who can sing or who have all these extra talents in addition to acting.
I mean, probably worth saying that Elizabethan theatres, the fabric of the building incorporated musicians in that. There's a balcony above the stage where Juliet appears. But actually, and is often used for acting, but it's primarily, as far as we can work out, that's where the musicians were. And interesting to think, so the musicians are visibble throughout the whole performance in a way that they're not in a traditional Broadway theatre today, where there's an actual orchestra pit where they're kind of hidden away. So that implies that music, or noise at least, is really important. And we know that plays began with a trumpet as a way of quieting the audience. So right from the start, and as you noted, that they tended to end with a dance. Weirdly, even tragedies. I guess everyone who's died got up and danced, kind of thing. So music's clearly integrated into all of these performances at the level of the fabric of the theatre, which is kind of an interesting way of thinking. And I should say, by the way, I noticed that when in the section on Shakespearean insults, I think Nick, you said that one of them looked like a really good band name.
Yeah, I think it was Horse and Caterpillar.
Yeah. So there is an actual band name in Shakespeare, and it's in Henry IV Part 2. where dull tear sheet, apparently the drawer says, oh, dull tear sheet wants to hear some music. Can you send for Sneak's Noise? So the band name is Sneak's Noise, presumably a guy called Sneak, and it's his band, but it's called a noise, not a band.
That's pretty good. I also love that you just said the plays usually started with music or noise, which is great, because I think, if I'm not remembering incorrectly, Emily will be talking in her presentation about how students can sort of do sound effects and make noise in the classroom as a way of bringing the comedy of Falstaff to life. And I love that it's, you know, music and or noise. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. And it's just another plug, what Brandi said, that like this, you know, some of our educators are humanities teachers, English, history, cultural studies. Some are choir directors, orchestra directors, band leaders. And so this is, you know, Falstaff and Shakespeare in general, this is just a plug for interdisciplinary collaboration, you know, working across departments and asking your friend who knows a lot about the history of the oboe what's going on, because that's where some of the most fruitful and interesting conversations take place. And they're probably more excited to tell you about the history of the oboe than you might otherwise think. So we're just about out of time. So I just want to thank Brandi and Jonathan once again for being with us. Everybody who's watching, please give them a round of applause and or an emoji. We're thrilled to have them share some of their insight about Shakespeare and Merry Wives. So thank you two so much for being here.
Thank you.
And have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Bye.